Hello, my name is John Mozie. Today I'm going to talk to you about a Biafran child in the aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War. My interest is purely around what happened to Biafran children during the Civil War and immediately afterwards, and where we are today. I think before we dive into the story of the Biafran child in relation to the Civil War, it's very important to sort of ask ourselves where we were. How did we start this journey, and how did we get here? That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to dive into the causes of the Civil War. What I want to do is to talk about what happened to the Igbos and where we were before the Civil War broke out, and how that, if you like, changed in the context of where we are today. So if you sort of go back to pre-1966, the civil service and the army were pretty much dominated by people from southern Nigeria, so southern Nigeria, southeast Nigeria, and also our cousins from western Nigeria. So there was a strong culture of education in eastern Nigeria, which saw communities get around to send children to school in the belief that when those children came back and with their qualifications, they were going to sow back into the community and make changes to the community where they lived. That strong culture of education is what also led to upward social mobility amongst the Igbo class of the time. So if you sort of think about people like the great names of Igbo past, people like Zik, Dr. Okpara, people like Chinua Achebe, the great Chinua Achebe. And you sort of look at their upbringing. Somebody like Zik, for instance, his father worked for the civil service and at the time had some education. He probably, I don't know what his background was, but he most probably went through primary school, senior primary school, and through secondary school perhaps, to have landed the job he landed in the colonial civil service. And he saw the need for education, which is why he raised his son, sent him to school, and Zik on his own went on to get a scholarship that took him on to the United States, where he ended up with a doctorate and became quite an influential figure in the Pan-Africanist movement, and ended up fighting and being the major driving force for independence in Nigeria. And such were the sort of background into which people came. So most families always sent somebody to university. There would be people who came over to the UK and the United States and even Germany to study. All those people came from families where, even if they were not literate themselves or were not read learned in the sense of going to school and acquiring degrees, they saw the need for their children, for education for their children. So it didn't matter how rich or poor they were, there was always a need to change the concept of the family by having somebody go to school. And we also had so apart from the strong middle class that we had, there was also strong cultural organizations. So it's something like the Igbo Union. It's such a driving force to even politics at the time. They spoke in one voice, and they spoke for the Igbos. And I aware that people made contributions. It was pretty much, you got your paycheck, you made your contribution to the Igbo Union for the huge work in being representative that they were seen to be doing at the time. So such was the strength of Igwebike, if you like, that that communal approach to improve things and to always push for a better outcome was something that was marked in the Igbo community, in the Igbo life before the war. So going on from there, you come to the war itself. And I've got a quote here from a man called Christopher Ejike Ago, and this is from an interview he gave to the BBC. So he had just gone into the university when the war broke out, and like most young students, he volunteered, he made himself available for war. And this is his own take on what that war looked like for him. So he said, look, we fought the war with sticks and stones, and they were child soldiers. So when Biafra ran out of volunteers, we started the process of conscripting. And in that conscription, a lot of young men were taken into the army. And some of them were people who were either teenagers or had older teenagers, if you like, or who looked like men, whether they were men or not. So a lot of these guys went into the army and they were fighting practically with sticks and stones. There were no guns. The equipment was quite rudimentary at best. We were precluded from obtaining arms because practically everybody was against Biafra at the time. There were slivers of hope. So if you sort of think about the push that got Biafra as far as Midwest before the federal troops pushed back. So there was, if you like, a belief in that the justness of the cause in itself was going to see people through the war, and there was some extraordinary belief in the abilities to get us there. And so people died, people gave everything they had. There were young men who went off to work. Some of them came back maimed. Some of them never came back. And there were horrific tales to be told of these young men who went out there to go fight for Biafra. And quite a sizable number of those people would have, by definition, been children. So going on to look at the war itself and its impact on the children. So I've got a quote here from Rob Williams, who is the CEO of the War Child, an organization in the UK, which is geared towards reducing the impact of war on children. So he says that no child has ever started a war, yet children are the innocent victims in conflict, caught up in violence that has engulfed their lives. And that is practically true for the generation of children who were in Biafra during the war. So one of the things that's become quite prevalent is in looking at the definition of genocide and whether what happened in Biafra was genocide. Now, for a long time, there were arguments about whether genocide had actually occurred or not. And it would appear that there was a sort of a move to play it down. And, again, because at the time Cambodia was happening, it was sort of felt that, Biafra didn't quite qualify for genocide, but that's not true. So these people, Lars Heaton and Mozie, amongst other people, have done significant work in looking at what happened in Biafra and comparing that to the United Nations definition of what genocide is. And the belief is that Biafra fits the definition or the global definition of what genocide is. Genocide occurred in Biafra. And if you sort of think about the number of people that were lost in Biafra, so of the 3 million people that were lost in Biafra, 1 million were children. It was a savage war. The strafing and the shooting and the efforts of the Nigerian Air Force did not necessarily do anything whatsoever to separate the population. As far as they were concerned, they targeted civilian populations, and in the midst of the civilian population were a large number of children. So the Air Force was quite instrumental in practically dropping bombs and shooting civilian populations. They targeted gatherings. They did not make any distinctions whatsoever between the civilian population and military targets. Everybody was a target. And the other thing that was also clear during that war was that at some point it became a technical war. So it became the first African war that was televised. So there's a quote here from Philip Gurevich, and quite a few other people. So he said, you know, there was another quote by somebody else, which is also quite pointed in the power of its delivery, where this person said, look, you know, we sat down and watched this war on television between dinners. So you can imagine what this meant to the people who were watching without necessarily understanding the human impact of it. And that is exactly what makes the Biafran War quite a unique war. So if you also think about the fact that it was the first war where you had the East represented by Russia and the West represented by Britain in complete unison of agreement as to support for Nigeria. So one of the things that will become quite apparent for any student of the history of the war was that when the war started, because the bulk of soldiers who were involved in the war, because of the bulk of officers were of southeastern descent, so Igbos, when they left the Nigerian army lost officers and did not really have that much munition to go to war with. So neither side was fully armed. But what happened was, as the war went on and sides were taken, the Nigerian army slowly became armed, and we are then able to, of course, as they got the help from Britain and primarily the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, who eventually lied to Parliament about what was going on in Biafra and continued to tell them that it was a police action which would be ended before they knew it. And of course, it dragged on for 3 years. And he pretty much funded Gowon. He gave Gowon guns and munition, and he was aware of what was going, because he was told, he was advised about what was going on in Nigeria, and he played it down. So, you know, so that's one of the reasons why the war was so heavily tilted against Biafra. There was hardly any international support, and it was quite savage in its execution, which is one of the reasons why we were seen as genocidal. So going on to who the war child was, looking at the demographic, it's pretty much not people who were born between 1954 and December 1969. So these were the ages that had, if you like, quite physically impacted by the war. So it went on essentially. One of the key things that I want to point out here is the statement that was made by Alison Aida. Now, Aida, if you recall, was one of the super PAMSECs. As a matter of fact, history has it that he became a permanent secretary. By the time he was 33, he was already a PAMSEC. He was the guy who led the Nigerian delegation to the Niamey peace talks in July 1968. So one of the things he said was that starvation is a legitimate weapon of war, and we have every intention of using it against the rebels. So you need to be very aware of this statement, because this is the statement that pretty much defined policy during the Civil War for the Gowon government. They blockaded Biafra, and what that meant is that medicine, foodstuff, raw material, nothing could come into Biafra. And it was a very effective blockade. They blocked the sea and they blocked the air. So most planes that tried to get into Biafra were either chased or shot by the Nigerian Air Force. So people starved. And, you know, it's such a serious thing, because of the 1 million people, 1 million children who died in Biafra, it is estimated that half of them died to malnutrition and hunger. So, you know, at the time, parents were making the painful decision to leave, you know, their sick children on waysides and walk away. I mean, there are even photographs of a dying child and a vulture waiting for the child to die so that it could devour it. So that was the strength of the destruction of the war and its impact on the Igbos. So at the end of the war in itself, it is reckoned that 480,000, between 480,000 and 500,000 malnourished and sick children came back to Nigeria in 1970. So if you sort of sit down and think about what the impacts of that number, what the impact is, you sort of begin to understand that without the nourishment that was needed to raise children, so the sort of things that you need for a child, vitamins, food very very high in protein to help with the development of the bones and the eyes and the brain and all that. People missed out on all that, and some children have been scientifically proven to be stunted in growth and to have had deferred development because of the effects of the war on them. So going on, there were also other things. So even before we come to this space, we need to talk about the children who never came back. So going back one step. So let's just stay here for a minute. So one of the things that happened during the war was that the Pope, based on what he heard from Bishop Okoye and another Catholic bishop in Nigeria, and also some other well-meaning people, got involved and started raising concerns about the strength of suffering in eastern Nigeria and Biafra. And that led to a few things. So it led to television cameras coming in. There was a conference. I think the conference was either in Frankfurt or in Berlin or somewhere along those lines, where the World Committee of Churches got involved and all that. And that opened up aid into Nigeria, into Biafra. And one of the other things that it did is that it also led to the airlift of children out of Biafra. So we'll come to that later. We'll talk about that in some detail. But here, let's talk about the growth. So when you talk about the growth, is essentially you're talking about the social changes that occurred because of the war. So a lot of people had not seen school for God knows how many years. So school stopped when the bombing started. And even though there was some sort of rudimentary education going on, it was rudimentary at best. And most people effectively stopped schooling for the 2.5 years, 3 years that the war lasted. And when people came back from the war, some children were so much older than where they were meant to be that they just couldn't cope. Quite a large number of children simply stopped going to school because they couldn't take the ribbing from the younger children. And then, of course, with all that, also came the fact that the schools themselves were ill prepared to deal with children who have just come out of war. Nobody talked about it. No, there was no social support, no psychological support. So the bottom line is that a lot of children simply just stopped going to school. And then the other thing I want to raise here is what I call the sins of the fathers. So if you sort of go back to the Bible where it says the sins of the fathers shall be visited on the son, it's almost what you see here, because after the war, the Gowon government handed every family, Biafran family, £20, and that was it. So whatever you had in the bank was forfeit. You had the case of the abandoned properties in River State, forfeit. So people lost property and the ability to hit the ground running. So at that point in time, some families made the decision that it was better to feed than to send the children to school. So that was another hit on education. And then you then talk about the government actors. So the things essentially that I see are specific to government and that affected the welfare and the economics of children who were coming out of that war. So there were people who had jobs in certain parts of the country who were simply told not to bother coming back to work because, those jobs were not going to employ Igbo people. So a lot of them ended up in the village with their lives changed forever. And they had to find new skills. And while they were finding new skills, their children were either finding new skills, some of the girls were getting married, and that's something that was very common. So girls, there was a heck of a lot of early marriage because parents just couldn't cope with looking after the girls. So a lot of the girls got married early, and not all those girls who got married early ever completed school. So you had that. So all these things essentially, and then you then had what happened later on with the Mauritania Mohammed regime and people being made redundant. That also put a heck of a lot of pressure on children of Biafra. So at that time, there were people who must have been 13, 14, 15, 16, coming into their teens that were affected because their parents lost their jobs. There was a large-scale sacking of civil servants, and a lot of people came back home and just couldn't find work. And, that changed the whole concept of the family in terms of where the children went, what happened to them, and all that. The last piece I want to touch on here is what I call surviving the peace. Now, surviving the peace is very interesting because with the end of the war also came a significant amount of violence to eastern Nigeria. So you had armed robbery went up, and people were shooting people to grab their cars and all that. And that also meant, in some cases, in unfortunate situations where the head of a family fell victim to any of these things, it impacted the family. A lot of those families never quite found their feet again. Again, the children never went back to school or had to finish education early and go get a job to support the others. So all these actors meant that there was a huge, huge impact on children who left Biafra soon after 1970 and continuing. Now, to count the costs is almost impossible to do. So let's just look at these figures here. 5 million Biafran children were airlifted to Gabon and Ivory Coast. And, of course, Sao Tome, which I haven't mentioned here. Now, of the 5 million that left during the 1968 airlifts, only 3.9 were returned. So there was a big hue and cry at some point in the 70s. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a guy called Prince Khan, got involved, and there were contributions from different nations to help fund the repatriation effort. So one of the countries that got involved in the repatriation process was Denmark. And I recall that Denmark gave $500,000, and other countries and organizations, including the World Council of Churches, also made contributions to bring these children back. Now, 5 million left, 3.9 million came back, which meant that there's a deficit somewhere of just over 1 million children who never came back. Some of them died on the way there. A lot of them simply went to new families and forgot where they came from. Nobody ever told them any different. Nobody ever came looking for them. And they're still out there. Now, what I've got here is a photograph of, this is the son of Omar Bongo, who used to be president of Gabon. His name is Ali, and he's now the president of Gabon. His case is very interesting because people of Gabon at the time accused him of being Biafran. He was born, history has it that he was born in Congo and then brought home to Gabon. When his father died and he became president, some people said that he was illegitimate. He didn't have a right to the presidency because he wasn't really Gabonese. He had been an Igbo child who was brought to Gabon and who Omar Bongo had taken on as a child and raised as his own. So that sort of gives you an impact of just how big an issue that this is. So even the purported adoption of the guy who now runs Gabon is linked all the way back to Biafra. There were other things. I know for a fact that there's an organization in the United States called the Igbo League, who's been working really hard to reunite families with these lost children, or lost adults now. Now, I don't know how far they've gone and how successful they are, but they have been at it for many years now. Now, the effects of the war did not end there. It also had impacts, what are known as fetal impacts. So these impacts essentially are actually cross-generational. So there is a belief, scientifically held opinion, that even children who were in the belly during the war, who did not see the war, have been affected by it. We know that girls who were born, who were children during the war, after the war, have had quite a high percentage of miscarriages and early child deaths, which scientists have linked to the effects of the trauma of the war and the changing in the body makeup because of the war. And then, of course, there are long-term health impacts that have followed a lot of the children of the war. So nobody ever treated anybody, psychological or psychiatric treatment for children who left the war. So they have been left pretty much to their own devices, and people have walked around with undefined traumas for years, and they are still there. And of course, there's also the other aspect that isn't talked about, which is the rape and the abuse that girls suffered in the war years. And that sort of leads on to the next thing about the changed Igbo society. So there is a belief that the war changed Igbo society. So, for instance, there is evidence that both Biafran soldiers and the federal troops, the Nigerian soldiers, raped girls and raped women. And a lot of those people who were raped never talked about it, carried the trauma with them. And what is the effect is that in some places people are saying that that's also changed Igbo society and changed the concept and the response to issues of sex, and drove to some extent a higher level of promiscuity amongst Igbo women who now felt that having gone through the abuse they went through and survived it, they could pretty much take a view on their bodies. Now, there are also other people that have also held the opinion that, well, actually, that there are bright shoots that came out of the war. One of those people is a chap called Onumonu, who is a lecturer in the University of Nigeria History Department. Now, his conclusion is that we became economically driven after the war, so that you had industry and trade in places like Nnewi that practically have become sustainers and have driven the trend to put money in the pockets of Igbo people. And he's saying that this has got to be looked at as a positive that came out of the war. So other people have also talked about the need now, the new attitude of building houses in the village. So most Igbo men will have a house in the village no matter what, whether they live there or not. I mean, a lot of villages are replete with derelict houses that were built and never lived in. There is also the concept of going home every Christmas, which again became quite a prevalent thing after the war, and that is driven by the belief that whatever you do, you've got to have a place in the village, because when people ran back from their stations during the war, they had nowhere to stay. So this is pretty much driven by that need to never to be in that position again. Now, my take on it is that I don't know whether I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying that it's been better for us. I think it is different. What has happened is that the Igbo people, as a people, have responded to the trauma of the war the best way they know how. It has changed society, and people have become quite functional in terms of building strong cash links and sort of taking their focus, sort of putting the focus around building strong economic links. The only thing that I would say there is that in doing that, we have also ceded the center ground to some extent. So if you sort of go back again to people like Zeke at the time, you had Zeke, you had a significant number of Igbo people, Ojinwafo Rizu, so many other people who were highly rated professionals, highly rated politicians, highly rated military officers. We practically have had to cede that center ground since the war. And that sort of explains exactly why you have such a huge preponderance of Igbo people who are in business and in sort of looking for sort of relevance that allows us that level of independence that we are used to. People have sort of walked away somewhat from, if you like, what was natural playing field, which was central politics, and we now have, if you like, strong business and commercial strength, and that is a change to society. Now, whether that's a change for the better or not, we will wait to see. And that brings me to Through the Eyes of the Child. So this is a quite a unique book. It's a book that I've worked on and with two of my colleagues, and it is 24. It contains 24 individual accounts of the war. Now, the beauty of this is that these accounts were all written by people who were children during that war. So these people are people who were between the ages of 4 and 15 during the war. So they were young people. They have sat down and they have penned their own perspective of the war. And what's interesting here is that that perspective is what you would find is that looking at that period from the prism of individual perspectives, no two perspectives are the same. So there are people from the same family who've written here, who's written in this book, written their own chapters, and their accounts of the war may well have similarities, but they are different. And it's a very interesting piece. And then I also want to draw us to a quote from one of the contributors to the book, Dr. Godwin Meniru. What he said here struck a chord with me. He said, "Loss of material items was not the worst thing that happened to me, and probably most Igbos during the war. Instead, we have a legacy of multiple traumas. But this is rarely talked about. We are war survivors, and the scientific literature is replete with documented trauma effects on populations such as ours." Now, Through the Eyes of the Child is available to pre-order from books at kimberbooks.com. So the address is right there at the bottom of this page, and it's going to be available on general release or in May to mark just before the Biafra Day. So if you're interested, by all means, put in an order. I will recommend that everybody who is a student of Biafran history and who wants to know about the war from the perspective of a child would want to get this book. Thank you for listening.